Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Southwell Soul. My name is Gladys, and today I'm sharing the second video in my education series for Southwell Soul. The idea behind this education series is to get people to think more deeply about education and what education means in society. For many of you, Enver Motala needs no introduction. Many of you will know him for all the work he's done in education, particularly in adult education, and in trade union education, and just in general social justice work. But for me, I know Enver because I was fortunate enough to work at the SACED Trust, and Enver was the director at the time. And Enver was more than just my boss. I think he wouldn't even like for me to say that he was my boss, but he was. He was our director, but he was my friend, and he was my comrade, and most importantly, he was my mentor. I learned so much from him and from SACED and from my colleagues at SACED, and I think it's my most memorable work experience was being at SACED, and it's guided me through, I think, through all of my adult working life. It's the grounding at SACED. So I'm so grateful to have had that, and I'm also so excited to share Enver's input with you. I'm doing it in two parts because it was 2 hours long, and so I've divided it into two. So this will be part one of that. Those who know Enver know that this will be thought-provoking, and for those who don't, this is a must-watch, and I know that he will leave you with some deep insights and with a lot to think about. So I wondered if you would mind first doing a little bit of an introduction, just saying what you've been up to and a little bit about yourself and yes, what's important to you. And then EM, we'll just move on to, I'll hand the floor over to you and you'll speak about what you think are the most critical issues we face around education.
Okay, so, well, about what I've been doing, Gladys, for the last, I moved here to Port Elizabeth about 10 years ago, and I was immediately asked to do a series of seminars by the university. And then I did those seminars, but very soon after, IRNA is here, so of course, I got in touch with IRNA, and she, of course, has got very good contacts with community and worker organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So we started, engaging with community organizations and trade unions, which in this region, of course, they're the same ones nationally. So, and we doing some seminars and work with them, which is what I generally do to this day.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to work I do for what is called the Center for Integrated Post-School Education, which is it's headed by Iva Barches. I don't know if you know Iva.
Yes.
Who is the head of that, and IRNA also works for that center, and a few of us. So I started doing some work for the center around these issues of community education, of bringing the university and communities together, opening up the discussions about what kinds of knowledge is produced in universities relative to the knowledge which is produced outside universities, and how these things can be brought together into a proper discussion about the big social questions
yeah.
we face. So that's what I've been doing essentially, just working with those kinds of organizations, and I get work from the university to do some of that.
And when you left, when did you leave SACED?
You might not remember, but I left SACED in 1991, I think, to set up the education, what came to be known as the Macro Education Policy Unit at the University of Durban, Westville.
Right.
And then, of course, in 1994, I was invited by Gauteng to join the bureaucracy.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was a government employee, a bureaucrat in government in the Department of Education in Gauteng. But I must say that it was a time of great learning, but also a time when I realized that I was not going to be able to work for long in government.
Yes.
And I resigned in 1998 and left because of a whole range of reasons.
Yeah.
And since then, I did work for what came to be known. In fact, I was instrumental in getting the various education policy units together, 4 or 5 that existed at the time, from Fort Hare to UKZN, to Natal at the time, to Wits, etc., putting them together. And we formed what was called the Education Policy Consortium. A body of representing all these EPUs at the 5 universities. And that went on until about, I did work for the EPUs. I was not employed by any one of them. I was employed by, as it were, I was supporting all of them jointly as part of as working for the consortium, as it were, for the next 10 or 12 years, until, of course, their funds ran out. And then, of course, it's about that time that I moved to PE also.
Okay.
And so that coincided with that, and I started doing some work. So at the moment, I also do work for what is called the Center for Adult and Workers' Education, which is headed by Salim Vali.
Yes.
At University of Johannesburg. Yesterday's event was hosted by that center, CAWE, Center for Adult and Workers' Education, which is based at University of Johannesburg. They have some things now and then, and so I was asked to do the concluding bits for yesterday on the launch of that book by Sherry and Linda. So I do work for them. I do work for years as EP, when I was as part of the EPC, the Education Policy Consortium, I did a lot of work with the Nelson Mandela Institute at Fort Hare.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember Brian Ramadiro and Kim. I don't know. No, they were not in the SACED days, but I worked with them. And I still sort of have links with all of these units. I mean, the point is that I have links with so many of these education policy and education institutes all over the country. I have links with all of them. Plus, I'm also an associate of Rasigan's unit, ERI.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I'm an associate of ERI, of the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation, of the Center in PE of the Mandela Institute. I'm an associate.
Okay.
I don't know what it means. It just means that, I can say I'm an associate, and they can say they have me as an associate. That's what it means, but nothing more than that, really. So let me start by saying, Gladys, thanks very much for asking me to do this. It's always very useful for me, not just for you, for me, because it enables me to think through the issues. It requires, to organize what I think are the most important questions which we have to think about and so on. So it's always useful for me also. So I appreciate it, and thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you, Enver.
Now, I listen to the radio nearly every day in the mornings, even while I'm doing my work. And so very often the issues are around education, nearly every day in the morning. You hear some or other discussion about education, about all the problems in education. And then there are a whole lot of people who come on and provides advice about what is to be done and so on and so forth. And what strikes me, and this is the first point, perhaps the most important point to understand in trying to understand any social phenomenon in any society, the most important issue to understand is that there are a very wide range of perspectives in thinking about any social question, whether it's education or health or, employment questions or whatever, social welfare, technology. There are a wide range of approaches. And the first question you have to always ask when listening to anybody, including me, is, well, what perspective does this represent? What are its underlying values? What does this person think her or his ideas represent? What kind of social system is being suggested in the way in which this person speaks about issues? Because although we don't recognize it, education, like any other social activity, is ultimately related to the question of what kind of society. That's the fundamental question which ultimately is being answered when you speak about, jobs or about health or about education or whatever. Ultimately, your answers to what you regard as the big issues are always related to what kind of society do you envisage. Now, if you read the pieces we wrote in relation to Fees Must Fall, and I must have written half a dozen pieces on that question, we were arguing there, for instance, as an example, that the whole of the debate was largely based on the questions of affordability. Do we have the money? Largely around, do we have the finances to be able to afford fee-free or free education for all? And our starting point, and starting point of not only me, but a whole range of people, including the students with whom we were very engaged. I certainly was very engaged with the students. I did some seminars and so on and so forth. We held a conference actually we hold an annual Neville Alexander Memorial Conference.
Yeah.
And that year we held the conference. We brought students from 22 universities to talk about these issues. So the argument we were making is, if you start talking about where will we get the money from, you're starting at the wrong end of the discussion. Mm-hmm. The discussion which we were asking the universities to enter into, together with the communities from which their students come, together with government, and in the associations of the university vice chancellors, of the principals, the discussion we were saying which should be had is, let's talk about what kind of social system we want to promote, and see what is the most efficacious way of dealing with the demands of students relative to that question.
Yes.
And not this question of where will we get the money from. Yeah. So, and we were saying that if you start there and you examine the development trajectories of countries throughout the world, you will find that free education for all is an absolutely fundamental premise, fundamental platform for the development of democratic societies. Mm-hmm. And so that the whole argument about financing of education is a subsidiary question. It comes after you've answered this first question. And then you can talk about, well, if that's what we want to achieve in society, where will we get the money from? Mm. And can we do it tomorrow morning? Or will it take a bit longer? Mm. And what are the first steps? How do we open up this question of where exactly society must go relative to its higher education system? So, that for me is a very instructive way of thinking about anything in society. Yeah. And it is there that the biggest contradictions arise. My second point really is that it is in this question of what perspective is being represented in any discussion about education or anything else. It is in that we can see what the contradictory positions are and what position actually relates to what kind of society. So, for instance, if you examine government's position on all these issues, it's largely driven by its fiscal regulatory mechanisms, its systemic approach, set of policies which are on paper, and the regulatory environment. And all of these, by the way, are often argued in terms of the Constitution. But as we know, the Constitution has become increasingly a piece of paper, which is honored by omission, and actually a great deal of what happens in this country goes against the grain. Extraordinarily, one of the ministers said to us at a time when we were raising questions about fees, schools being paid fees, that he was surprised that we hadn't gone by way of a constitutional challenge against the idea of fee-paying schools, schools being made to pay fees. Yes. But this was after he had made concessions about it, the concessions we now have, some which are not complete. And I must tell you that, we were planning on approaching the Constitutional Court on this precise issue. Neville and John, Samuel, and a group of us were involved in thinking through all of that. But when we heard about the rigors of constitution and legal systems and the time it would take and the amount of legalistic work we'd have to put in order to find the evidence and to make the arguments and so on, we had second thoughts about doing that instead of doing work really, which is possibly more useful, more work, like for instance Neville's work on the language question, which really is such an important fundamental set of issues, and that work is being done by the Mandela Institute and so on. So we didn't mount a constitutional challenge, although that was pretty obviously a case in point. If you take the attitude of middle class people, education is about mobility, upward mobility. It's about status. It's about acquisition of qualifications. It's about incomes. It's about better wages.
Yes.
None of it by itself is a problem, but it's obviously not what education's primary function should be. I mean, the idea of social mobility is very much a part of any meritocratic system like the US system. It's built on the idea of social mobility and the promotion of middle classes. And part of our own approach to higher education is exactly that. If you take what big business talks about, well, it's so very clear. You just have to listen to the daily discussions on the radio and wherever. It's about labor market questions. For them, there is absolutely no value whatsoever in education unless it's about fitting human beings into the labor market, into a factory system, into a work regimes, whatever the work is, and especially the big talk about artisanal skills and scarce skills and so on and so forth. It's about what is called human capital theory. The idea that actually human beings, the greatest educational purpose is to convert human beings into increasingly valuable widgets of capital formation. Human capital, that's what it is. By the way, that's the book that we wrote by Salim and myself, Education, Economy and Society. And if you read the first 2 chapters of that book, you will see our critique of exactly the limitations of that approach. Communities, urban and rural communities, what are they asking for? They're asking for really just very basic, fundamental rights and fundamental capabilities to get them out of the perpetual cycle. In class societies, working class children have very, very little option, and rural children have very, very little option other than the option of reproducing the social system in which they are. In other words, working class children become working class children, 95% of them. A very small percentage of them actually manage to burst through the iron wall of the obdurate social systems created under capitalism. Very few of them. So for them, it's about the basic requirements of getting out of poverty, out of the trap of social marginalization, of being able to exercise their human rights. And in the process of all of that, of course, they too want social mobility. They too want their children to have. That's why they sell their cattle, so that they can send their children to schools and universities. So they too seek that. For, of course, social movements and trade unions, the issue is gender justice. It's about justice against racism. It's against human dignity and fairness. That's what it is. A whole range, you know, it's the whole discourse of social justice is entirely about all of that. And so too is the discourse of organizations which represent all kinds of little groups in society which are interested in environmental issues. They're no longer little, they're actually becoming extremely important social movements. Movements also in relation to educational questions, the environment, the language issues, etc., etc.
Yeah.
In other words, those movements which are really critically interested in a framework of social rights, which take the vast majority of the citizens of the country outside the morass of marginalized existence. That's what it's all about for them. So you can see that there are real fundamental differences in all these perspectives. These are philosophical differences, they are political, they are logical, they have different perspectives in regard to economic questions. But perhaps most importantly, the differences are about what exactly is the purpose of knowledge. That's what I think underlies a lot of these differences. And unfortunately, the institutions of knowledge production, which are our universities, are, in my view, extremely weak on this precise issue. Because of the power of corporate capital, whole university systems have become no more than adjuncts of the requirements of corporate capital, human resource, human labor power. More and more, if you think about schooling education, it's as though there is nothing in education, in learning, other than the STEM subjects. You know, the whole of the emphasis and all their funding and all their support. And so too with universities, very often. The work they do outside the university, for instance, in what they call their engagement functions, is almost always about helping with maths and science classes and language. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong. But if that becomes the sole purpose of your engagement with communities, if that's how you see the function of education as being dictated by the demands of that kind of education, narrow demands of labor market education, actually, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Then I think that your understanding of the purposes, the social purposes, what I have written about extensively about the social uses of education or socially useful knowledge, you know, all that falls outside the realm of knowledge which is useful for the purposes of production. And we know, Gladys, we know that actually a great deal of work is done outside the formal labor market. I mean, let's take, when I was a bureaucrat and I was looking at early childhood development.
Yeah.
Well, we had about, in Gauteng, which is possibly the best resource province, we had about, I can't remember now, 100, 150 ECD centers. Nearly 90% of them in the white suburbs of Gauteng. My figures might be completely wrong, so forgive me if my figures are wrong. But the point is that we knew that there were close on to 1 million children living in the townships who were being looked after by the kokos.
Yes.
In every street, there was a koko, an old grandmother,
yes,
who was doing this absolutely imperative work that enabled parents to go to work.
Yes.
That looked after these children, that provided some kind of care. It's not about education so much.
Yes.
At that age, from the point of view of what exactly they were learning social skills.
Yes.
They were learning how to get on with each other. They were learning for collective and cooperative behavior. They were learning, hopefully, sharing.
Yes.
They were learning respect, especially for the koko and so on, and for each other and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Absolutely fundamental to any humane society. These are the most important. And it is this kind of caregiving that makes capitalism run, actually.
Yes.
Capitalism gets free labor from every single household in the world, provides free labor.
Yes.
Because the realm of capitalist production is not in the factory. It is possible in the factories because of what happens in the homes. You know that better than I do, because when in preferential labor markets where the man is paid higher wages to work, and in many, many labor markets where women are not employed except as cheaper labor and in lower positions, they continue to do all the work that has to be done to reproduce labor, to reproduce the family, actually. And in the process of reproducing the family, they are reproducing labor. Not just biologically, but on a daily basis through the care, the sustenance, all the things that go into the process of making life possible. That's what reproductive labor does every day. And it's not paid for by capital. Now, there's a lot of writing on this, especially more recently by some wonderful thinkers on this issue, people like Sylvia Frederici, Sue Ferguson, Bhattacharya, et cetera, a whole range, Mojab, a whole lot. And there's a wonderful literature, if you're ever interested, that has placed this issue four square and saying, look, we all talk about exploitative labor in the production system, but actually that's it's a very incomplete view of the way in which capitalist labor functions. And it's related to education, precisely because of what I said. Education is not simply about a set of technical or scientific or arithmetical or linguistic skills. It is that. It is that. We're not saying it's not that. But that is not the whole of education. And especially because that education is being daily subverted, is being daily compromised by the demands of the most powerful interests in society. So the issue of whose interests are dominant in shaping education arises from everything I've said. And I don't think one needs to guess too much who exactly shapes, who is, to use a well-known concept, who is hegemonic in shaping the path which education has to follow. It has no real options except if policymakers take this debate on openly and frankly, which they're not prepared to do, because actually they too have fallen completely prey to the agenda of global capital. You know, every day, if you read even our economic strategies, it's about fiscal rectitude, it's about export promotion, it's about high skill, et cetera, et cetera. So the language, and by the way, to be absolutely honest, and I've said this publicly to the trade union movement in a conference, that they too have fallen into the trap of capital's agenda in regard to the skills issue. I think they're aware of it because they can see now, for instance, with COVID, how easy it is to let 3 million workers or 2 million workers, you know, get booted out.
Yes.
Despite the fact, this is despite the fact that they have the skills which they've been asked to get in order to get the job.
Yes, yes.
I mean, you just have to drive out every morning, Gladys, and you look at the workers, unemployed workers, standing on the street corner with their trowels and their little boards and their, you know, paint brushes. These are skilled people.
Yeah.
Some of them have got years and years of experience and skills.
Yeah.
But they are now absolutely redundant from the point of view. So the most important point that I'm making until now is that it's absolutely essential when talking about education or any social good to understand what perspective it represents in relation to the social, to the question of what society. And the other issue, which I think in South Africa is such a pertinent question, and of course it's now becoming globally pertinent with this Black Lives Matter, is that how are we dealing with the quest, what Neville called the national question in education, or are we dealing with it? Well, I'll tell you how we're dealing with it. Any form put out by even a university, leave alone government, even a university, these institutions of knowledge production. And if you start filling it, an application form for this, that, or the other, ask the question of what race in this age, day and age.
Yes, yes, yes.
You go to a police station, they'll want to know what race.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, the constitutional mandate, which says that, you know, these apartheid categories of race are invalid, is just absolutely nonsensical because they reinforce it. We are reinforcing these racial categorizations every single day. And listen to the public discourse. Listen to it. Let's just listen to it every day. Listen to the politicians. And if they are not reasserting the power of racist discourses, racist ideas, then I'm listening to something which doesn't exist. Well, what I hear every single day is a reassertion of the, and you know, this, as Neville has pointed out, this is an explosion waiting to happen. This is a genocidal explosion. Now, what is the distinction we must understand? We're not talking about racism which we must speak about. I'm not talking about racism. In other words, the effects of an ideological system which determined that all of us belong to particular racial categories. Yeah. That's the ideological system. And how we talk about this thing called race can either deepen it or can say, look, we're not talking about race as an essential or biological category. It is totally nonsensical. There is no science, which, although the eugenicists, as you see now, there are people beginning to reinvent this thing, especially in the US, reinventing this idea of the old Nazi idea. Actually, it's much older than Nazism. It comes from Linnaeus, the original categorizer of scientific categories. It comes from that nonsense. But despite the 200 years of critique, of analysis, of debunking, of calling all that rubbish nonsense, we continue to be reproduced in the public discourse, in policy arenas, by politicians, by people in business, in the university system, by liberals of all kinds, completely by many of our own friends and who we know. They reproduce this discourse uncritically. It's different from saying, look, I'm writing an article about the way in which transformation is taking place in this country. And one of the measures is to see how people who were marginalized, socially marginalized, and they happen to be Black people. Actually, for myself, I don't know what the hell the need is to even, say, coloreds and Indians and Africans and all of that.
Yes,
we know who the marginalized communities are.
Yes.
There are 100 characteristics by which we can identify them. Isn't that so?
Yeah.
If you take the arena of entry into university, selective entry, you can say, well, from a rural area, who are they likely to be? 99%, 99.9%, who are they likely to be if not Black children? Kids who are the first few who are going to university, kids who haven't had an opportunity to, who speak a different mother tongue than the language that is used in universities. Yeah. Kids who got over 50% in every subject, instead of the kids who got 80% in every subject. And you can see who those kids would be. You can close your eyes and guess who the kids would be. So there are many other ways of dealing with the problem of affirmation, of making sure that those who are most marginalized in society are given real opportunities, not fictitious opportunities, but real opportunities in education and in other social arenas. So, and this, by the way, the other thing about education is that very often the discussion is broken down sectorally. Like, look, I'm interested in schooling. I'm not interested in preschool or adult education, and so on and so forth. I think that's a mistake. Yeah. I agree that we have to choose our area of concentration and focus and so on and so forth. But for me, there is no real difference in the fundamentals which affect any of these areas of education. and there are real differences, I agree, between urban and rural access and so on and so forth. Just like there are racist differences also. The effects of racism, the effects are the same as urban, rural, are the same as poor and middle and upper class. are the same as private and public schooling, etc., etc. But what is very, very important in relation to all of these areas of education, and this is the next point I want to make, is that we have to regard them as a part, as essential to the public good. Because increasingly, what is happening globally is this process of privatization. And we know that only a small percentage of the population, no matter how well-intentioned the private provider might be, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how honorable or decent or how much the private provider says, if you read their pamphlets, you'll see all this wonderful talk about fairness and justice and opportunity and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And I have got, I'm not complaining about parents who have chosen to go that way. That's absolutely understandable in the circumstances of a primary schooling system, which really degrades our children more than supports them, actually, in general. So I wouldn't want my child to be degraded by this particular system, which is available to 80% of the children. But which isn't to say that I wouldn't do something at my own school where I go and try and do some things to support schooling. But the general point I'm making is that the difficulty we now face is that not only is the public system discredited by its own degradation, it is now supporting the idea that the only way to resolve the problems of education is through their privatization, through its privatization. Because look how much better so-and-so's child is doing because he or she is at this private school. And it's true that child is doing well. And if you listen to the child, you feel, this child is learning something, is doing well and so on. But the general reaction should be, man, isn't this terrible that the vast majority of our children don't have this opportunity? Exactly. That should be our response. Yes. It should be, we should demand of the public sector that it does what it is obliged to do, which is to provide public education for all, good quality public education, that it should do everything in its power to do that, and not simply accept that the lowest common denominator is good enough for the vast majority of our people. In other words, to adopt a completely cynical and anti-social attitude towards education, which I'm afraid is largely what is going on presently.
Yes.
But privatization, as you know, is a global phenomenon. And it's not just about education. There are huge swathes of educational systems, like in Kenya now, which is being taken over. There are big parts of India which is being taken over. We in South Africa, our private providers are every day increasing. They are the fastest growing companies, profit-making companies. They are hugely profitable. If you've got money to invest, you put it into private education, and that's where you get your best possible returns. And of course, the matric results at the end of each year, they show you how much better they are doing than the public system. But that's not the issue. The issue is about whether democratic societies can allow this to happen, should allow this to happen, whether we should simply put our fate in the hands of the 60 global billionaires who run the world. I don't know if you've seen the Oxfam figures recently about the share of incomes and wealth and so on. I mean, we wrote an article recently, Erna, myself and Sia, in Workers' World Media, in which we start off by saying, isn't it extraordinary that under COVID, the 20 richest billionaires in the world have actually added to their wealth so many billion, so many billion, you know. We now have a South African, this Elon Musk, who's now the, one of the 3 richest people in the world. And everybody in South Africa, wow. Well, well, it's absolutely disgraceful that in a country where, how many million people, Gladys, are going to bed hungry? How many, even by the states, the government statistics, about a million people go to bed hungry every day in South Africa. By some data, I don't know which you can choose whichever you want, but it all runs into millions, people living below the poverty datum line. It runs into millions. The unemployment figures, 10.5 billion before COVID. What is it today? And then we say, but we've got one of the 3 billionaires. It's like the Indians, sending rockets to the moon. When 60% or 50% of the Indian of the population doesn't have a toilet to go to.
Yes.
So, what are the priorities of democratic government, and how does it see its responsibility to the public good? Is its responsibility to the public good equivalent to the handing over by government? And I'm not talking about corruption. Corruption is an element of it, is one part of it.
Yes.
The problem starts with the privatization of the public sector. That's where it starts. It's handing over our electricity utility to private suppliers. It's handing over our railway system to private suppliers. It's handing over a whole range of public functions to private suppliers. It is determining our policy trajectory on the basis of what the bankers in the world determine is good for us, the Moody's of this world. It is handing over our public accounting system to multinational corporate accounting firms, et cetera. And all of these things are an attack on democracy. That's what they are, essentially. They're not just about the privatization of the public good. They're a direct attack on, and it makes the Constitution completely nonsensical. Because in the absence of the defense of the public rights, which are set out in the Constitution becomes a completely meaningless a document. So I think protecting the public good, advancing the public good, pushing back the power of privatization and market and market fundamentalism, the idea that everything must be driven by the demands of the market, pushing back those anti-democratic ideas, which actually ultimately, if you don't, because even now, Gladys, a small group of global multinational corporations have taken over the food supply systems of the world because they've monopolized food, they've monopolized seed, they've monopolized the fertilizer industry, they've monopolized the energy industry, they monopolized the food distribution system, they have taken over forests, they are busy destroying huge amounts of forests in so many countries in the world. They are destroying the environment, they are melting ice caps, they are causing a huge rise in in sea levels, which are going to wipe out countries, poor countries really, like Bangladesh is already seeing the effects of all of this.
Yes.
And these are decisions made by a small group of unelected, neo-fascist, undemocratic corporate billionaires sitting in a room. If you put all of them together, they probably fit in a small hall. And they are making these decisions, momentous decisions for the whole world and for educational systems. So that's what we're up against. Now, I must say, contrary to all of this, that what is also beginning to happen and what is happening, has been happening, is a very wide range, global range of challenges to these things. They're not as powerful as the corporates, that's very clear. They're not as powerful as governments. And governments, in fact, are supporting the corporates instead of supporting these other alternative initiatives. And there are initiatives which are being developed very often by women, but they have to do with alternative food systems. They have to do with alternative livelihood systems. They have to do like cooperatives.
Yes.
They have to do alternative ways of buying and selling. They have to do with factory takeovers, like in Argentina and so on and so forth, where factories are dying as a result of their being abandoned by their corporate owners, regardless of the effects on entire communities. There are workers who have taken over some of these factories now.
Yes.
So there is now a burgeoning discussion and activities and organizational forms being formed around, for instance, collective forms of work organization, of cooperation, of production, distribution, consumption, even of financing, alternative financing networks, alternative energy approaches in the world of environmental struggles. There's a whole lot of stuff which is now becoming quite more widely known about alternative approaches to the energy question. And the unhappy thing is that it's not being supported by governments anywhere, despite their pretensions to be democratic governments. They continue to support the corporate. And where they do support cooperatives, like our own cooperative legislation, it's a complete fraud. It's taken over by a few people to support, their own familial and other networks. And actually, what the effect of it is to destroy the kernel of the idea of cooperation. So there are a whole range of alternatives which are being developed. And many of these are beginning to demonstrate how it is possible, what is possible.
Right.
But it requires much greater levels of collaboration, of networking, of active building on the ground. That's why, Glad, for me, the work people do in communities at the local level, not at the, I think it's important to continue to try and have some impact nationally and globally and so on and so forth. But at the moment, the opposition to this hegemonic global system has been so weakened that, in fact, I think the most productive work has to be done at the local level, seriously done at local, with in communities, to try and get hold of municipal resources to demand particular forms of local government planning, and from there, to expand all of that to deal with local level education, knowledge, and literacy, to support the building of more social consciousness. That's what has to be done, I think, which is very important at the moment, and to understand the limitations, the weaknesses of. There are understandable weaknesses, but I'm saying that that's because the hegemonic global framework is against everything that the local is trying to do. Yes. But amongst the things that can be done, that has to be done, is to respect the vast reservoir of local knowledges that exist, the vast body of experience, precisely experience of people who have lived through a daily struggle to make livelihoods possible, to keep families and communities going, to support the old, to look after the ill and the infirm, to clean up their environment, which is happening, to start local gardening projects, to support each other. Yes. And this is what is beginning to happen. This is where I think, for me, the possibilities, to support the kinds of work that waste pickers are doing, the people on street sellers are involved in, but to do that in a way that brings greater cooperation. That's what I think. For as long as one leaves those things at an individual level, they'll remain survivalist. And that's what's at the moment. There are billions, possibly, of people globally who are just living on the margins of society in the most survivalist way.